Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID. My guest today is Giselle Yasmin. Welcome, Giselle. Uh, Very pleased that you've joined us. Giselle, you're the executive director of Food Secure Canada, yeah?
Yeah.
And you've had, enormous experience. You sent me a short paragraph, but I could spend the entire program talking about you. But you've had many, many years of leadership experience in knowledge and organizations, having served as a not-for-profit and federal government executive, including vice president of research and partnerships at the Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And you've been into the whole issue of food systems for a long time, both in Asia and Canada, and published widely. I can't go on to all the different titles that you hold, but just to say, it's really nice to have you. And thank you for spending time or giving up your time to join me with us. So welcome.
Thank you for the invitation, Firoz. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, so look, first thing, Canada's a rich country. It's, you go around, it's got lots and lots of agricultural land, it's got lots of water, it's got lots of industries. It's a rich country. So what's all this about food secure? What about food security? I thought this was something that only concerned third world countries.
Well, right you are. I think it is a illustrative of, what are the issues? Why is there food insecurity, not just in wealthy countries like Canada, but around the world? And the frank reality, even though many would have us think that it's about too many people, not enough food, food insecurity or hunger and malnutrition, and some are saying nutrition security now, is primarily an issue of poverty and inequality and not one of food supply. And issues of poverty and inequality affect countries like Canada, as well as other parts of the world. And there's structuring of poverty and inequality, often along racial lines with Indigenous peoples, etc. So the latest statistics, for which we had a very well-attended webinar delivered by Dr. Valerie Tarasuk on March 26th, it's on our website, the recording, a summary, showed that pre-COVID, there were 4.4 million Canadians suffering from food insecurity. It's kind of a shocking figure when you think about it, Firoz. When you think of our population. So when you think, that's pre-COVID, and that is, what's our population? 35, 36, 37 million? But we were not a highly populated country. And so among those 4.4 million Canadians that are suffering from food insecurity, there are, 1 in 6 children. Black Canadians are 3.5 times more likely than white Canadians to suffer from food insecurity, and half of all First Nations families suffer from food insecurity. The same can be said for Métis and Inuit. And so the statistics are quite shocking, and experts are saying that they expect with the impact of COVID-19 for those figures to double by the end of the calendar year, which is end of December. So again,
help us understand what is meant by food insecurity. What does that mean?
Food insecurity is when there is a situation where food cannot be accessed and where it is not affordable, not because it's not necessarily available, and where it can be accessed both financially and physically at the right time by the right people, and ideally in culturally appropriate ways. So the standard definitions of food insecurity come out of the World Food Summit, remember, in 1996. There is an agreed upon international definition. There are people who suffer from food insecurity because of the supply gets blocked, right? Because of maybe armed conflict, for example, or other reasons. There have been supply chain disruptions where the right food doesn't get to people at the right time. But as you know, Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that food is an entitlement and is not related. 3 million people died in the Great Bengal famine, not because there wasn't food, but because they couldn't access it. So in a country like Canada, it's primarily about income inequality, and the solutions are around more effective distribution of income and what we argue basic livable income as per our new policy brief, Growing Resilience and Equity on food insecurity, food sovereignty in the context of COVID-19, which is available on our website, which I would encourage listeners to, viewers to have a look at.
But so here we are, this Canada, which everyone talks about as being a rich and liberal place, is suffering from vast numbers of people actually not having adequate access to food.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. Not adequate access to food, not because the food is not available, but primarily because they can't afford it. And those who are in vulnerable situations, we did a report on this, issued about a year ago, May 2019, would often like to eat healthier food, but can't actually afford it, and so are therefore suffering at higher rates from chronic disease, diet-related disease. So these things are all tied together. This is also in our report, in our policy action plan, and in the Valerie Tarasov webinar, the chronic health issues associated with food insecurity, which is related to structural inequality, poverty, tied in with racism, impacts of colonialism, etc., is having a huge impact on our economy because it's, as you know, the determinants of health are social.
Okay, so Canada is not only a rich country, it's also a colonizer and still controls stolen land and pushes the indigenous people into unsustainable land and regions and continues to desecrate the land with mining and oil and gas explorations and so on, and pipelines, and even poisoning their waters. But what does that do to the food security of the people there?
It's had disastrous consequences. And I would just also like to remind all of us that there are several layers of colonialism in this country. So, there were the indigenous peoples here since time immemorial. There was the French presence, then there was the conquest of the French by the British. So there are also various patterns. And the question of land, resources, water, etc., custodianship over those lands, exploitation over those lands, the need for indigenous food sovereignty approaches where First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples have control of their lands and waters and reclaim their traditional foodways and country foods is a huge part of this discussion. So it cannot be separated from land claims, it cannot be separated from biodiversity and environmental degradation, and also the chronic health issues that have been associated with a Western industrialized diet being imposed on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples.
So it's more than about merely the distribution and accessibility of food. I mean, these zones tend to, I read, import food rather than grow it themselves.
That's right. There is an harvesting. I mean, there's a harvesting issue. And so there is a movement. There is a whole social movement around Indigenous food sovereignty and reclaiming that. In the face of COVID-19, a lot of communities are locked down. These communities are at higher risk of COVID-19 because, again, you can't separate food, which is a basic need and human right and necessity of life, with other basics like housing, etc. So when you have populations living in crowded conditions, they are more susceptible. Determinants of health are social. So when you have populations that have all sorts of impacts of inequality and poverty, the more susceptible. So these things are all tied together, and the need for control over land and resources, food, water, energy, these things are all related ultimately, and not just what we call Canada, but around the world. I mean, it's a global issue. So the kinds of things you see in the global south, there are pockets of this in the so-called global north. So these issues are all interrelated and interconnected.
Right. So what does Food Secure Canada do in these situations? Are you just producing policy papers? Are you providing food? What's your role in dealing with the insecurities of food?
Well, Food Secure Canada is a national bilingual not-for-profit organization. We're pan-Canadian. We work on 3 core areas: reaching a healthy, just, and sustainable food system. And we see all of these issues as interrelated through the lens of food security, but also food sovereignty, this idea of who has control over the food system. And we do that in 3 principal ways. We don't do direct program delivery. We do knowledge sharing. We promote networking and convening, and we also do advocacy. So that is our role in the system. There are many others across the system doing excellent work, and we see ourselves as supporting that work, lifting those voices, and promoting this kind of discussion and influencing how we think about this food system. And the roots of our work go well beyond the founding of our organization to the People's Food Commission in the late 1970s, for example, and global food movements around the world that have been expressing concern for the past 30, 40 years or more on how our food system is structured, and from everything from production and processing and distribution to consumption and all of the issues, disposal, all of the issues around that, the economic issues, the health issues, etc. So that is our work, and we published in May, on May 14th, Growing Resilience and Equity, which I would like to invite people to look at as a policy action plan in the face of COVID-19. We're also invoking the Sustainable Development Goals, to which Canada is accountable to meet the 2030 agenda, which includes a zero hunger component and moving towards a more sustainable view of production, of food production, and also improved nutrition. So we see ourselves as a player that helps shape the debate and move things forward on the ground, and COVID-19 is a way of a unique opening, in a sense, for these discussions. Suddenly, all sorts of people are talking about these things without having not really thought of them before.
Right, but what I'm hearing you saying, Giselle, is that we're dealing with systemic issues. It's not merely the shortage of food. There are systemic reasons.
Yes.
And to what extent also then, linked to that, is food insecurity also a reflection of the other systemic issue of racism in Canada?
Absolutely. And so all of these broader social issues racism, colonialism, class structure, gender issues, etc., all play into the food system and are matters of concern for food movements and the food movement and related food movements as they are for the environmental movement, the women's movement, human rights, the civil rights movement. So, there are issues of power and control in our society. And we have institutions which are in desperate need of reform. We have control over land and resources, land, water, energy, etc. I mean, these are global challenges, and they are issues here in Canada as well. So, and even just the notion of Canada sort of evolved and is not one that everyone who is a citizen of this country officially necessarily buys into. So there are broader issues in which food plays a part, and at the heart of it is question of who has control. This is where the food sovereignty concept is so important. And as I think the whole concept of food sovereignty came out of a peasants' movement led from the global south called La Via Campesina. And I was well aware of that work since the 90s. What I didn't realize is that actually there were Canadian farmer organizations like the National Farmers Union that played a key role in La Via Campesina. And people like Nettie Weeb were actually chairing representation for La Via Campesina for all of North America, Canada, US, and Mexico. So there are really exciting things that have happened in this space over many, many years. And the struggles are similar around the world. So, access to resources is one of the most contentious public policy issues, as we know. So, who has access to resources? Who does not have access to resources? Why? And how do we have a governance system that raises the voices of all stakeholders, not just big industry, etc. Where do we? That's why we have played a role at Food Secure Canada as per our Growing Resilience and Equity Policy Action Plan, that the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Committee, which was promised almost a year ago now, and actually had a call for nominations and has not been named. It's time to name that committee because, again, what decisions are being made? What decisions are being made right now around COVID-19? They're going to have impacts for decades. So we need to get this right. We can't go back to the way things were. Normal was just not acceptable for a lot of people, both in this country and around the world. So, this is the moment to do things right, to reset the clock and address some of the root causes of food insecurity, etc.
So what does resetting the clock mean for you then?
Well, what it means for us, as per Growing Resilience and Equity, it means addressing the root causes of food insecurity. So again, poverty and income inequality, moving towards basic livable income, which is not the same as basic income, but livable income schemes, and having a permanent way of dealing with that. So we've seen experimentation, right, with the CERB, etc. It's amazing how quickly things can happen in a crisis. Building resilient local food systems. So, Canada imports, we export 30% of our food, we import 50% of it. I mean, they're absolutely ridiculous. We've seen supply chain disruptions, which have shown how ridiculous the system is, diseconomies of scale. Of course, we're not saying we're never going to import-export. We'll always be an import-exporting country. But we have the opportunity, we have statistics that show that even increasing local production and purchasing, particularly of fruits and vegetables, which we should all be eating more of, according to the Canada Food Guide, which is the best guide in the world, would have huge positive economic impacts in terms of employment and stimulating the economy, etc. We are strongly advocating for Indigenous food sovereignty approaches. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples need to be in charge of their own food systems. And that has to happen. That is an unfortunate and ongoing legacy of colonialism, which needs to be addressed now through different approaches. And upholding justice for workers all along the food chain. What a wake-up call this has been in terms of invisible workers to many, particularly in urban situations. The importance of farm workers, especially temporary foreign workers. The importance of all of the food workers along the food production and distribution chain. The displaced workers that have come out and how vulnerable many of them are. That has to be addressed. I mean, it is not acceptable. We had a webinar on April 14th, I believe it was, that fed into our report on COVID-19. We had Elizabeth Kwan from the Canadian Labour Congress. Decent work has to be at the top of the food systems and food transformation policy and program agenda. And then we have one programmatic, strong programmatic recommendation, and that is to have a national school food program for which we and others have advocated for many, many years and was promised in budget 2019, federal budget 2019, and nothing has been done. And building such a program in collaboration with the provinces, with the Indigenous leaders, other stakeholders, building on what's already there would be a way to stimulate the economy in a progressive way, particularly by sourcing local, healthy food. We could meet health outcomes. We could have a positive impact by investing in such a program almost as a public works initiative. So we support the Coalition for Healthy School Food. And I've already mentioned the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council. We want a strong voice for civil society within food policy governance. It cannot just be the voice of industry, and it cannot just be, we need to have citizen groups and not-for-profit organizations involved in these governance discussions. And it's just not happening enough right now.
I think you've raised an important issue, which is often not talked about, and that is the process of production of agricultural commodities, and in which migrant workers play a very significant role. Can you talk more about the conditions faced by migrant workers and how you relate to that aspect of food production?
The Canadian food production system is highly, highly dependent on foreign workers, foreign labor, many from Mexico, Caribbean, other parts of the world. And there was a report that was just published actually in the last few weeks that showed the evidence of their conditions. It's hard to get evidence sometimes when your employer is holding the passport. So that report is really important that came out a few weeks ago, and that shows the typical living conditions. There have been some adjustments in COVID-19 and whatnot. The vulnerability of many of those workers, some of whom have been coming for 20 years, every growing season. So there's been a push by groups such as advocacy groups such as Justice for Migrant Workers, etc., to really look at what are the needs and the very legitimate demands of these workers, temporary foreign workers, in terms of what's their status in Canada. There should be opportunities for citizenship, for permanent residency, etc. So again, all of these different citizenship and immigration issues are playing into this, but there are also issues I just want to flag based on what Elizabeth Kwan said at our webinar, that there are decent work issues even for permanent residents, even for citizens, etc. So there is a broader issue at stake. But I was happy to see that the Prime Minister mentioned the other day that temporary foreign workers in the agricultural sector had not been adequately protected. And so we've called for that since particularly the onset of COVID-19 on March 18th. And in all of our communications, the voices of these workers need to be heard, and the organizations that are concerned about their protection and their rights need to be at the table, and those issues need to be taken seriously. It's a critical part of our food supply. Many of them have very technical roles too. You can't just suddenly, repurpose a restaurant worker to be a beekeeper, for example.
Right. Okay, so there are a number of terms that are used on your on the Food Secure Canada website, and one of them is a strapline that I've used here, decolonizing the food table. What does decolonizing the food table mean?
This is on so many levels. When you think of, if you think of colonialism as a global undertaking, that's one way of looking at it, that we have all been part of some kind of colonial relationship, and that has played out in food systems all over the world, and that has happened in Canada as well. Canada is a product of layers of colonialism, so is not at all immune to the questions of access to land, access to resources, water in particular, of particularly Indigenous populations, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and the power and control issues around food and food systems that stem from that. So these, I think, there's also a mental challenge around all this, Firoz, is, how do we, all our institutions have come out of various colonial structures, and sometimes we're not even conscious of that. We've internalized it. So how we think about food, how we talk about food, and these and other basic necessities, housing, water, etc. So where you stand depends a bit on where you sit. It's like the Bob Marley song, emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. So I think what this has been, for me personally, something that affects even how I look back on my own work on food systems. And even I'm colonized too in many ways, in terms of my own background and how I think about things. So how you engage with this debate and the issues and the priorities and who speaks. If I could just mention one thing, for example, Food Share in Toronto is having a webinar featuring only Black women food sovereignty activists towards the end of June. And that's fantastic. They're from around the world. And, whose voices do we normally hear? So I think there's broader issues, and then there's the very immediate material issues around the impacts of colonialism, of accessing food, accessing nutritious food, having control over the food system and your own nourishment and that of your family and that of your community and that of your region and nation, etc. And then there are those kind of epistemological, if you don't mind me saying, ontological issues around how we see ourselves as part of a global food system, and how we hopefully reframe that conversation to address issues that we've known about, those of us who've been working on in sustainable food systems for a long, long time.
So what's been happening recently has been with the torture and killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the uprisings that have taken place and which have had an impact in Canada as well. Um, One of the things that's emerged out of that is a greater interest in the work of the Black Panthers. And just recently, there's an article about which by one of those involved in preparing food parcels, doing the breakfast programs, and so on, which was entitled "When We Need It to Be, Food Was a Weapon."
Oh.
You've talked about the sort of scale of hunger and inadequacy of food and so on. To what extent are we seeing communities in either urban or indeed other areas organizing in such a way as to seize control and not leave it merely to the state and food policy to deliver?
I think that's one of the most exciting things that I'm seeing right now, because the global food movement, and we're now saying it plural, food movements, social movements around food and food systems, are connected to, interrelated with other social movements. So whether it's environment, and the need to move towards agroecological, regenerative, organic agriculture approaches, or whether it's questions of race and civil rights, whether it's question of colonialism and the place and the rights of First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples, these things are all interconnected. So what we are seeing at this moment, this global pandemic has shone a light on all of these structural issues. And the question of food and our relationship to it, depending on where we fit in these structures, is becoming very, very, very evident. And it's forcing a conversation on food and race, food and colonialism, etc. Because so much of our discourse is dominated by middle class, urban elites, many of whom are of European ancestry, but not only. But so again, we see things as we are, and so for those who've experienced hunger and deprivation, or their own identities being suppressed through food systems, etc., that is all coming to the surface right now. And I actually find it hugely exciting and a turning point, not in general. So for society at large, and where food and food systems play a very critical part. I mean, you can live without a flat screen TV, you can survive, but we cannot live without food, water, and many would say energy as well, and healthy food in particular. So chronic disease, by the way, related to food is costing Canada $26 billion a year. So there's another statistic.
Well, that's in terms of obesity, diabetes, and so
yes,
on.
Cardiovascular, so many issues are related to healthy eating. So, and then if you're unhealthy, you're more susceptible to communicable diseases. So, these things are all interconnected. And, the last thing we need is for this COVID-19 experience to be simply seen as a virus in search of a vaccine. So, we have to get to all sorts of root issues, and on all dimensions of food, whether it's the social justice dimension, the health dimension, the environmental sustainability dimension. There were several key reports last year, IPCC, which really were waving a red flag. The world cannot go on, and it's not the peasants of the world that are causing these issues. We cannot go on with this high input, fossil fuel dependent, environmental destroying system of agriculture and food production and distribution, et cetera. We have to, move towards these more environmentally sustainable approaches. So, these things are interconnected. It's a system.
So one of the things that emerged from our discussions with people we've interviewed from India, uh, from Indonesia and elsewhere, has been that this crisis that COVID has created for small farmers who are unable, because of lockdown, to get their products to market. And that's consequent.
Yes.
They have losing income. They are suffering from deprivation, and counterpoise to that, in the cities, people are going hungry because they can't find the food, and its price of it has gone up. To what extent are we seeing a similar phenomenon here in Canada?
It's interesting. In some ways, there are similarities. In some ways, there are differences. I mean, the whole local, food movement or food system is kind of flourishing. Whereas the larger scale food system has experienced some very serious supply chain interruptions, all sorts of logistical challenges, because it's gotten quite big and cumbersome. And it's been very, very hard on the farmers. I mean, they're having an extremely hard time, and it's very difficult, not to mention absolutely ridiculous, to have to dump and throw away food that can't make its way from point A to point B. So we do have very serious supply chain issues in this country. There was a report actually before COVID-19 on staggering levels of food loss and waste in Canada, which is a wealthy country. Again, something like 60% of the food produced in Canada was wasted, according to that report. So it's even worse with COVID-19. So we need a more resilient, supple, more regionally focused, locally oriented supply chains, so that we can weather these storms. I mean, today it's COVID-19. We could have an earthquake. We could have all sorts of other, disasters on our hands. So we have to think about that resilience, food loss and waste. And there are also challenges for small producers. There are sometimes rules or lack of access to cold chain, because so much of the infrastructure is in the hands of the largest corporations. And so our small and medium producers and processors and distributors don't necessarily have the kind of access and power and control that could move us towards a more resilient food system. So there are challenges here. They're a little different. I mean, the global south, that food waste is often post-harvest. So there are all sorts of very simple ways of improving that. If you look at what's been done in dairying in India, for example, there have been inclusive approaches to protecting small dairy producers, but keeping that food from spoiling and enhancing their livelihoods. But we need to separate out the supply chain issues from the poverty issues, in the sense that there are two different things going on, and they're both important, and they both need to be looked at very seriously. I mean, there's nothing worse than producing food and wasting it. That it's unacceptable.
There a lot of debate, and we've had people speak about this on organizing at the time of COVID. Rob Wallace, people from ETC Group, and others. That the industrial agriculture and industrial livestock production has been based on large-scale deforestation, and that there are strong arguments and evidence of the fact that COVID and many of the other viruses which have been prominent in the last period are a function of that deforestation and the role of industrial agriculture. And clearly, industrial agriculture also has a major impact on food, given that most of it is directly used for food as such. So tell me about to what extent does Food Secure Canada take on the whole role of the large-scale industrial companies?
I think that's a very important part of our work, is to look at those impacts. And, in terms of the global impact that you mentioned, I just want to point out that in our policy action plan, Growing Resilience and Equity, we would like to see a better marrying of the Canada's global role in food insecurity with our domestic policy and programs. So you saw that perhaps the other day, the Minister of International Development had a statement on food insecurity, etc. We would like to see Minister Bibeau and her counterpart as the Minister of International Development working together more effectively to have a kind of logical framework that moves towards the same thing. But we have a lot of concerns about very large-scale industrial agriculture, both in terms of environmental impact, in terms of control over land, in terms of marginalization of others in the food system. I'll give you a U.S. example. The whole corn belt in the U.S. Look at, there's a handful of companies that are involved in that vast agricultural heartland that go towards producing all of this junk food that we are all being aggressively marketed into consuming far too much of, with detrimental inputs detrimental impacts on our health and well-being. So, there's land grabs happening around the world, to produce this kind of food using methods that are having a very negative impact on the environment. I mean, meat can be raised sustainably through pasturing. There is such a thing as sustainable meat production, and there's even labeling issues in Europe that are starting to surface to, what meat is, how is it raised, under what conditions, etc. But this highly concentrated production with high inputs of fossil fuels and pesticides and herbicides, etc., workers, close together, animals close together are, breeding grounds for all kinds of diseases. So Michael Pollan has written about that. And the same holds true down the line. So not just on the production side, on the processing side, on the distribution side. So, that has to be looked at as a public health issue, and it has to be looked at around the world. I mean, how do we prevent these viruses from emerging in the first place? And we've known for a long time that influenza often comes around how pigs and chickens are kept. And so the solution is not to, move towards the kinds of structures that we've seen in much of North America, for example. We need a better way. We need to, address the poverty and inequality issues globally, but move towards more sustainable, economically, environmentally, socially sustainable production and distribution systems.
Great. Well, it's been really interesting to hear from you and get a better understanding of the nature of the issue of food security in Canada. Is there a sort of final message you would like to say to people watching this program?
Well, I would like to thank you, and I'd like those who are viewing and listening to get involved. Get involved in social movements around food. That includes getting involved in our organization, supporting work around this. There are so many ways to get involved. There's not just one way. There's, becoming part of very hands-on activities, but there's also just the intellectual work of talking about this with your with your friends and family and colleagues. And, this is a moment to really reach out and change the way we think and talk about and govern and intervene as citizens. And citizens have power. People have power. And I think that's the last thing I'd like to say is that our organizations it comes out of a people power movement. So the power is out there. It's out there in society around the world. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing people come together demanding change because of the way this pandemic, so these are not issues, but the way this pandemic is really shining a light and exacerbating issues that were well known for decades, hundreds of years, etc. So, this is the opportunity to step up now. We have a whole letter writing campaign, very easy on our website. You can write to your MP in about 1 minute. We want citizen engagement. We want people to get involved.
Great, great. Well, thank you very much for joining us here today. It's been really interesting, and I look forward to hearing more about the work of Food Secure Canada. So thank you for sparing time to join us.
Thank you very much, Firoz.
Okay, you take care.
You too.
Okay. That was Giselle Yasmin from Food Secure Canada. I think threw some interesting lights on the systemic issues that are faced with we faced in terms of food security. We've come to the end of our programs this week, and I'd just like to say thank you for joining us today on Perspectives on Organizing in the Time of COVID. And we look forward to you joining us sometime in the next week. This is Firoz Manji signing off for today.